So to remind you, in our previous lecture, we ended up reaching the pole together with Amundsen on December 15. And 3 weeks later, Scott reaches the pole. I just moved the slide forward, and if you can see that, that's fine. If not, let me know. And Scott reaches the pole once again 3 weeks later with complete disappointment that he was second to this achievement. And then Amundsen makes his way back, waltzing on the snow on his skis safely, and reaches the ship that takes him back to Oslo. And at the same time, Scott fights for his life and makes a very difficult journey back, at the end of which he and all his team members unfortunately find their death on the ice in a distance of just 12 kilometers or so to the nearest depot that would give them the food and fuel that they were missing. So this was a tragic end of the Scott expedition. So what I'd like to do now, which is basically the end of the previous lecture, is to compare these two explorers and try to learn something from this epic story. So first of all, look at the team size. Scott went to Antarctica with 65 men. It was a big, bloated group of people for which he had to carry tremendous amounts of supply, food, fuel, and other resources. Whereas Amundsen took only 12 people together with him. The distance was quite similar. Amundsen had a somewhat shorter distance, but his terrain was much more challenging. In particular, he went in a complete uncharted territory. He had no maps. He had no idea where he was going. He was blazing new ground in every step that he made. Whereas Scott was progressing in the footsteps of Shekeltone, which went a few years before him. So he had maps and he knew exactly where he was going. In terms of transportation, Scott's plan was to use motor sledges, which broke down after a few hours of use, ponies who died a few days after they were set on the ice, and then he resorted to men hauling, which completely consumed the energy of his team members, whereas Amundsen was just floating on the ice with his skis and his dogs, and making tremendous progress all along. Scott's marking and making of the depots was improvised and unprofessional, whereas Amundsen marked everything very meticulously, which made it easier to find these depots in times of distress, which happened a few weeks later when he needed these depots. Scott laid only a few depots, whereas Amundsen took about twice as much food and fuel and medicines as he needed. He used only half of what he took. And he always had a surplus of everything. The clothing of the British expedition was once again improvised using wool, which soaked water, became very heavy and quite a torture to operate in. Whereas Amundsen's survival skills were based on his great knowledge of the Eskimo culture, and he used furs and moccasins and the right boots, and all the equipment was very well adapted to life on the ice. So once again, Scott had no margin for error. He was fighting for his life all along. Amundsen had everything planned out in advance. The attitude of Scott to this expedition was a very sort of macho, conquering type of bravado. And yet Amundsen was once again one with nature, a very holistic attitude. He was actually having fun going to the pole. He was not going to suffer. He was going to enjoy the trip. Scott's leadership style was very hierarchical, top-down, tyrannical. He kept his plans to himself if he had plans, whereas Amundsen was very participatory and he always shared what he wanted to do with his team. For example, the team knew that every day they will make exactly 30 kilometers and not more. And if they finished the 30 kilometers at noontime early, they would stop there, make a tent, cook tea or soup and call it a day. Whereas Scott always pushed his men to the very last bit of energy. And at the end, it ended up tragically with death. The state of mind in Scott's team was one of anxiety, uncertainty, constant challenge, whereas Amundsen, once again, was at awe from the nature around him and in complete harmony with the team and the terrain. The secret weapon, which is sort of another property that I added to this table, is that Scott was simply a very courageous and heroic figure. Tragic, maybe pathetic in some cases, but truly heroic and brave. And yet Amundsen, who was no less heroic, also had tremendous professionalism and competence and fantastic knowledge of living on the ice. And at the end of the day, this has won the game. And there's a great saying, which I think is a very important life lesson, and that is that opportunity favors the prepared. Amundsen was very well prepared. Scott was not. So that's the end of our tremendous race to the South Pole. And with that, I'd like to move to today's lecture, in which we'll talk about Shekeltone and the saga of the Endurance. The Endurance is the name of Shackleton's ship, and the definitive book is called Endurance, after the name of the ship, written by Alfred Lansing. I highly recommend it, and if you have a chance, do yourself a favor and read it, because it's a page turner. You will have a hard time putting it away. Before we set out to describe the saga of the Endurance, I want to say a few words about the overall Shackleton career, which was based by and large on 3 milestones. First of all, in 1902, he joins Scott and Wilson as a junior team member, if you recall, and they make it to a distance of about 1,000 kilometers from the pole. This was the farthest south record back in 1902, and this was quite a failure because, once again, in the very typical Scott spirit, they fought for their life. They almost lost their life several times during this expedition. So this was quite a failure. 7 years later, after this expedition, Shackleton goes back to England and raises his own expedition, of which he will become a commander. And he makes it to about 100 kilometers from the South Pole. So once again, he doesn't reach the pole, but he returns to England as a great hero. So we can call this a glorious failure. When people asked Shackleton why he turned around and didn't make it all the way to the pole, well, obviously he did it because he was lacking food and fuel. And he said, "I thought that my wife would prefer a living donkey on a dead lion." Well, we don't have his wife to interview, but as you see, this is an example of Shackleton's practicality and common sense. And then in 1914, he raises money for another expedition, which was also an aborted failure, but it ended up also being a legendary rescue, the story of which will be told today. So I want to say a few words about every one of these milestones, beginning with the first adventure of Shackleton in Antarctica, which happened once again in 1902. We see Shackleton here on the left, Scott in the middle, Wilson, who was a scientist, a wonderful scientist and a great reporter on the right-hand side. And this trio is bound to the South Pole. Shackleton was, as one of his peers said during this time, he was a young, steady, high-principled man, full of zeal, strong, hardworking, exceedingly good-tempered, a marvel of intelligent energy. He was a very capable and competent operator, but once again, like everyone else in the British team, he had a complete ignorance of snow, ice, and survival skills that were necessary to survive on the ice. And Scott, at the same time, get my notes right. Scott was a young naval captain in the British merchant navy. He was ambitious, he was physically very strong, yet mentally he was weak, insecure, and manipulative. He reached his assignment as leader of this team almost by accident, and he was vastly unprepared for the task. So from the very moment he met Shekeltone with all his very positive and exemplary virtues, Scott immediately identified Shekeltone as a threat to his leadership, an upstart that he has to worry about. And this made Scott very resentful toward Shackleton. And this resentment grew during the trip, because on the way back, if you recall from the reading that I gave you in the first lecture, Shackleton became ill and started to develop signs of scurvy, in Hebrew, tzafedet. He began to cough in a very sort of erratic and continuous way. And you can imagine how it is to spend a day or two with someone who cannot stop coughing in a tent, in a blizzard. It's not fun at all. And at some point, they had to put him on a sledge, and Scott and Wilson ended up carrying Shackleton, who was once again ill. And when they came back to London, Scott wrote a few articles in the press. In one of them, he said, "We could not make good progress because we had to take care of our invalid." And you can just imagine the feeling of Shackleton, who was a proud young man, reading these words. This developed in him a tremendous resentment and sense of revenge. And he was determined to show Scott and the rest of the world that he could do much better than that. And indeed, he manages to raise about 40,000 pounds back then, which is a lot of money, and get a ship called the Nimrod, I think. And he sails to Antarctica and blazes a trail to the South Pole. And here we see Shackleton and Frank Wild, another person in his team who will become one of the heroes of today's lecture, and the third member, whose name is I don't know. And once again, they make it to about 100 kilometers from the pole. The trip is very, very erratic, full of problems, full of challenges. It is marked by all the problematic virtues of the British approach to exploration in Antarctica. You know, an unbelievable, almost criminal and baseless optimism that things will somehow work out without proper preparation. sloppy preparation, incompetence, ignoring the experience of others who were there before them, and almost a masochistic strategy for trying to do things in the most difficult possible way. This was the British way, of which Shackleton was a good representative. And yet, in this particular trip, Shackleton not only makes it to 100 kilometers from the pole, he also publishes 2 volumes of maps and notes and guidelines and advice to people who will go after him. And indeed, 2 years later, his arch nemesis, Scott, using these notes and using better preparation, goes once again to the South Pole, competes with Amundsen, and we know the end of this story. Both of them make it to the pole, but unfortunately, Scott and his team perish on the way back. So this is the end of the beginning of today's lecture. This is the stage on which the Shekeltone third expedition unfolds. So let's fast forward and go to 1914. And let me get my notes right. And at this point, Shackleton finds himself, we find Shackleton in London. He is several years after his last expedition on the ice. He's restless, he has a drinking problem, and he's looking for action. Now, the South Pole was taken. It was conquered, so to speak, by both Amundsen and Shackleton. So this was something that did not interest Shackleton. Did I say Shackleton? I meant Scott and Amundsen. So Shackleton was looking for something else to do. Well, he looks at the map and he comes up with this tremendous idea that, maybe I should be the first person who crosses Antarctica from end to end, from the North Shore to the South Shore through the pole, obviously. So that's about 3,000 kilometers trip in the hardest, harshest, and most punishing terrain in the world. And there's a small problem with this plan, which is that when you get to the pole, after you made about 1,400 kilometers on the ice, you're going to be completely out of food and out of fuel. So how exactly are you going to make your way to the other side of the continent? Well, Shackleton has this grand idea that perhaps he will send 2 expeditions to Antarctica. One, led by Shackleton himself, will sail to Buenos Aires, and from Buenos Aires, they will go south through the Weddell Sea, which is the worst sea in the world. They will go through the sea. They will land in the north side of Antarctica. At the same time, another expedition led by a colleague of Shackleton, whose name was Anais McIntosh, will sail to New Zealand, the other side of the globe. And from New Zealand, they will go to McMurdo Bay, to the area of Scott's hut. And from there, the McIntosh team, the junior team or the secondary team, will go all the way to the pole, and on the way back, they will lay depots of food and fuel, which will serve the Shekeltone team that will come from the north side of the continent. So this was an absolutely crazy plan. I hope you agree with me. And when you think about the degrees of optimism and recklessness that such a plan entails, only then you begin to understand what we can call the Shackleton spirit of exploration. So off they sailed Shackleton to Buenos Aires, and Mackintosh to New Zealand. Took them about 6 months to reach their destinations. And from there, they each continue to sail through the ice pack to Antarctica, and each begins his designated mission. So let us put the story of the Mackintosh expedition on the back burner, and we'll return to it toward the end of the lecture. And so, or just as an anecdote, when before they set out, Shackleton has to recruit a team. So he puts this ad in a British newspaper: men wanted for a hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long month of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Well, he got about 5,000 applications to this attractive ad. And from these 5,000 people, he chose about 100 very highly qualified people from all sorts of professions. But if there was something that united all of them, was once again a complete ignorance of survival skills on the ice. So off they go. And here you see sort of a grand global map that shows the route of the Shekeltone journey, or the Shekeltone party. So they leave England, go to Buenos Aires, continue south to a place called South Georgia, which is an island that I will describe in a few minutes. And then the story that unfolds, the great rescue operation that we'll describe in this lecture, took place in this small triangle that you see at the bottom of this map here. And here's another view of the world map, and zoom in on the Weddell Sea, which once again is the most forbidding and dangerous sea in the world. South of Cape Horn, if you can sort of connect the dots. And we see the entire trip laid out on this map here. As you see, it's a clockwise trip. You can tell from the numbers. And I will now begin to describe the main legs in this trip one by one. So the whole thing, by the way, takes about 3 years. So they leave in December 1914. They return almost 3 years later to London. In the middle of this period, World War I erupts. And when they come back, they find the world in complete turmoil. And I also have to say that after about 1 year of getting out of London, all their friends and relatives count them as dead because they hear nothing from them. I also have to say that the two parties, the Shackleton party and the Mackintosh party, had a complete lack of communication. There was no way to make sure that any one of these parties actually did what it was supposed to do. So once again, quite a plan. So Shackleton begins to sail south from South Georgia. And South Georgia, just to give you an idea, is roughly around Falkland Island, south of the Falkland Islands. It's part of a group called the Sandwich Islands. And it's a whaling station. So it's a small island, about, I think, 100 kilometers wide, about 50 kilometers high on the map. And it serves mostly ships that hunt for whales. And during the summertime, you can find several ships at bay in South Georgia. During wintertime, nothing happens because everything is frozen solid. So they sail to South Georgia and they spend a few days there with the captains, the whaling captains, and have some good drinks and food. And then they continue the trip down to Antarctica. Now, unfortunately, the trip is not very successful. And after about a few weeks of sailing, they run into bad weather, and the sea begins to freeze around the ship, around the Endurance. And the Endurance is completely trapped in ice. And that's roughly 0.3 on our map. And here we see the pictures, or one of the pictures of the Endurance locked in the ice. And the arrow shows you roughly where it was. Quite close to the continent, close to Antarctica, but you have to understand that by then, when the sea freezes around you, there's no difference at all between the water and the land. Everything is connected in one huge sheet of ice. So that's one picture of the Endurance. Here's another one taken from the same time, January 15. Here's another picture of the Endurance. You know, all these pictures are really haunting and fantastic. They were taken by a great photographer by the name of Frank Hurley, who was part of the Shackleton team, and using the most primitive camera and equipment, he managed to take about 200 pictures of the team and the ship. And at one point, all these photographs were almost lost. I will describe this point later on, but luckily they were saved. And by now you can find many copies of these pictures on the internet if you look around for Hurley and the Endurance. Now, what happened during this time was that the Endurance was locked in the ice, and it began to float with the ice in the general direction of north, which was good. This was the direction of home. And it was going with the currents in a very, very slow pace. And after about 10 months of complete darkness in the winter, they made about 1,000 kilometers by sort of gradually floating together with the ice all the way to the point which is shown now on the map, the upper arrow. And then a few days later, the ship began to disintegrate. What happened during this time is a phenomena that we discussed in our last lecture, which is known as pressure. And in certain situations, the water currents under the ice, under the snow, operate in such a way that they carry or they build what is known as pressure ridges of floes and icebergs that begin to close on the ship from several different directions and begin to simply crush the ship down. And the crushing of the ship was not something that happened immediately. It took about 3 weeks to see the ship kind of pathetically imploding and breaking into itself. And the men had 3 weeks to plan what to do in this situation. And obviously, they began to salvage from the ship as much equipment, food, fuel, and supplies that they could. And basically, they emptied the ship completely. So they were very successful in that regard. So here we see the dogs looking at the ship breaking down. And here we see one of the men looking at the ship in its last moments. And this man, by the way, was Frank Wild, who will feature later on in our story. There's something in his body language which deserves a comment, I think. You can see great tenacity in the body language. You can see self-confidence and a person who was completely fearless. The British, as I said before, 100 people chosen out of 5,000. All of them were very powerful people, both physically and mentally, people who dealt with all sorts of hardships and problems and adventures previously in their life. And they didn't take this situation that you see here as a catastrophe. In fact, they took it as yet another adventure that they have to somehow endure. So in that respect, the name of the ship, Endurance, was very appropriate. So after removing and salvaging the equipment, we see here teams hurling lifeboats out of the ship. The ship had 3 lifeboats on it, and they salvaged all of them. They put them on sledges and began hauling them. At the bottom picture, you actually see Shackleton standing with his famous hat, looking at the people hauling one of the boats. And so they haul the equipment, and they spend the rest of the winter in a camp that they build on the ice. And they call this camp very aptly Camp Patient. They spent 6 months in this camp, and they build some huts and tents and a central kitchen, which you see at the bottom right. You can see Shackleton sitting next to the improvised oven that they built, and next to him, one of the men skinning a seal. They could hunt seals, which were in abundance around this place. They didn't lack any food. They had fuel. They had water as much as they wanted. And you see them playing on the ice. All in all, they had a great time spending a few months in Camp Patience. Of course, they were full of worries and uncertainty, but Shackleton found a way to keep the men busy and in a good shape. He also had a plan, and of course he shared the plan with his men. And the plan was some sort of a stepwise strategy. The plan was to spend as much time as necessary on the ice until the ice will begin to thaw and turn into water. Because I have to remind you that during this time, they were not on land. They were actually on a frozen ocean, which was going to turn into water at some point when summer will ensue, which happened around April or May. And so the plan was to stay on the ice in this camp as much as possible. And when summer comes, to launch the boats and to try to sail north to a place called Elephant Island, which was an island which was on the middle of the way between where they were and South Georgia, which was the place that they left almost a year before. So at some point, after spending more than a year since the Endurance was trapped in ice, Shackleton begins to think that the time has come to leave the camp. Indeed, the camp begins to disintegrate, and pools of water begins to form around them, and they wait anxiously for the right minute to launch the boats and start sailing north. So here's another picture, another drawing that describes the situation. And on April 9, 1916, Shackleton gives the order, folks, it's time to go home. And they get into their 3 lifeboats and begin to row in the general direction north. And so this trip actually was very successful. The first sailing that they had. And the sailing was rough, obviously. And yet, even though they were surrounded by huge icebergs and floes, they managed to make very good progress. Every once in a while, they attached the boats to one of the icebergs and built a camp on the iceberg and stayed overnight on the ice. And this whole experience was very, very dangerous because every once in a while, these icebergs would split, sometimes in the middle of the night, into two separate flows. And some team members found themselves on one part of the iceberg and others on the other part. In one of these anecdotes, Shekeltone found himself marooned alone on one of these flows. And one of the team members described in his diary that the few minutes that he took to fetch Shekeltones back to us were among the most anxious I have ever known. So this was the nature of the trip. But once again, the trip was successful. And after about, I think, 2 weeks of sailing, they get to Elephant Island. And I think I went through this before. These are pictures that show what I just described. And then they find themselves landing in Elephant Island. Now, Elephant Island was indeed terra firma, real land. This was the first land that they set their foot on for more than a year, because up until this point, they were either in the water in the boats or before on frozen ocean. And yet, even though it was terra firma, it was also a desert island. It was a bleak and inaccessible patch of rock and ice, about 30 kilometers wide. And it was also not only barren and inaccessible, it was located hundreds of miles away from any shipping route. So there was no chance at all that a rescue ship will ever get close to Elephant Island and rescue them. So they had to figure out what to do next. But at the beginning, they were simply happy to complete this leg of the journey. And here we see the moment in which they actually reached land. And we didn't know whether to laugh or cry, said one of the team members. We took childish joy at simply looking at the black rocks and picking up stones, for we stepped on no land for more than a year. So this was definitely a moment of joy. Here we see the men building a shelter from the boats and having a 5 o'clock tea together with Shackleton on the left. Once again, a quote from one of the journals: gathered around Shackleton, grizzled and weather-worn, was a group of ragged, unkempt creatures with dirty faces from which the eyeballs shone unnaturally white against the dark grime of ingrained blubber soot. Just to explain one sort of grisly detail, they had to use blubber, which is the fat of seals, for everything. Because, you know, whenever they wanted to heat something, to turn ice into water or to make themselves a cup of tea, they had to somehow turn the light on, and the blubber was their source of fuel. And this blubber was terribly smelly and dirty, so they were always covered with sort of a constant layer of blubber on their faces and hands. And so at this point, they have to decide what to do next. They are stuck in this place, which is literally the end of the world, with no chance to connect with any sign of civilization. And their only hope once again, is to somehow get to South Georgia, which was 1,000 kilometers away. And it also meant another very hazardous open sea boat journey from this island to South Georgia. So Shackleton had a plan, and the plan was as following. Shackleton, by the way, always had plans. He was never short of ideas what to do next, and this was one of the secrets to his success. So he decided to establish a camp in Elephant Island to use the time that they had to turn the 3 lifeboats into 1 sailboat. So one of the men was a very gifted carpenter, and so they took apart the boats, not the entire boats. They kept the hulls of the boats, but took apart everything else, and from it they built one somewhat decent sailboat to sail with this boat to Georgia, which was 800 kilometers away, and or 800 miles, I don't remember, and from South Georgia, send a rescue ship back to Elephant Island to pick up the rest of the men. Because altogether, I think they were 36 people. So the plan was that 6 of them will go in the sailboat and 30 will remain on Elephant Island and will be rescued later on once the party of 6 reaches South Georgia. And this plan reminds me of this cartoon which I once saw, in which you see some sort of a dungeon, and in this dungeon you see 2 people shackled to the wall, and one person says to the other one, "So here's my plan." And this was very characteristic of Shackleton. In the face of almost impossible prospects and complete despair, he always had a plan on what should be the next step out of this miserable situation. So they built a ship, or I shouldn't say ship, they built this boat, and they call it the James Caird. James Caird was one of their patrons, one of their benefactors and donors. So they christened the boat by his name, James Caird. And in April 24, Shackleton and 5 more men get into the boat and set out. And here's another quote: "With a final wave of hands and 3 squeaky cheers from us and the penguins, Shackleton and his crew set off on their hazardous journey to South Georgia." So let us put ourselves for a few minutes in the shoes of the people who were left behind in Elephant Island. Well, here they are in a group picture. As you can see, this was not exactly a picnic. They were suffering miserably, and they had to spend a considerable amount of time in this godforsaken place. The commander of the Elephant Island party was Frank Wild, who was one of Shackleton's lieutenants. And Wild knew that it would take about 2 weeks for Shackleton, in the best possible conditions, to get to South Georgia. But the chances that he will make it to South Georgia were probably something like 50-50. So he was hopeful that in 2 weeks' time, Shackleton will get to South Georgia, to his destination, will begin to arrange a rescue ship and come back to pick them up. But in fact, the 2 weeks pass, and another 2 weeks pass, and another month goes away, and another month, and yet another month. And altogether, the men had to wait 4 months without getting any sign of a rescue ship. And this was a desperate situation in which Wild showed tremendous skills and leadership ability. His biggest achievement was managing to control sanitation, housekeeping, and routine. And his main problem was morale, but he managed to always keep his men busy. And Wild was a very quiet person, very unremarkable, even unimaginative, but the men regarded him with something that ranged between affection to worship. He was very cool, very tranquil, very silent, and he exercised wonderful control without any outward sign of authority. He was a very humble man. And he was the ultimate second in command, exactly what Shackleton needed to live back in Elephant Island before setting out to South Georgia. So let us put Wild and his party on the back burner and see what Shekeltone was up to. So Shackleton and the 5 men went into the James Caird and began the trip to South Georgia. Once again, this was about, I think, 800 miles, about 1,000 kilometers. And what you see at the bottom right is a stamp which was made to commemorate this epic journey. And this is in the history of exploration, this journey falls under the category of open boat journey, a boat which is really not designed for long distance trips. And there are 2 famous such trips. One is Shackleton's trip in the James Caird, and the other one is a trip that was made by Captain Bligh, who was the captain of a ship called the Bounty, about 100 years before Shackleton. The Bounty left Tahiti, going to Indonesia, but after about a few days of sailing, the sailors in the Bounty mutineered, rebelled against the captain, Captain Bligh, and they wanted to go back to Tahiti. So they put him on a small lifeboat together with a few other men and turned back to Tahiti. And Captain Bligh managed to sail all the way from this spot to Indonesia, which is something like a 4,000 kilometers trip. Took him about 2 months. It was still considered the greatest open boat journey ever. And Shackleton's trip is probably the second greatest open boat journey that you can think of. So here's another slide that shows this leg, the open boat trip from Elephant Island to South Georgia. Altogether, 6 men on the boat going through the stormiest and most punishing sea in the world. And they were going to do it in a boat that looked like an insect floating somehow on the tidal waves. You know, in this sea, you have waves which are, you know, routinely 10, 15 meters high. And the boat, the James Caird, was badly designed for this trip. Not only it was a makeshift improvised boat that was made from 3 lifeboats, it wasn't really made for sailing. It was made mostly for floating, you know, on the water. But somehow they managed to raise the sails and sail forward. And they had a routine. You know, there were 6 men, and the routine was based on 4-hour watches. In every watch, 3 men were manning the boat, and the other 3 men were resting. 1 man was holding the helm, or the tiller, the steering wheel of the boat, if you will. Another man was manning or handling the sail, and a 3rd man was always bailing water because the ship was constantly filling with water all the time. So 4 hours of this, and then 4 hours of rest, and repeat. On and on. This took about 16 days of sailing, this routine. And they also had a great challenge of navigation, because, you know, finding an island in this ocean, going 1,000 kilometers is a very challenging objective in terms of navigation. If you're off by just, you know, a fraction of a degree, you're going to miss this island by a huge margin. But they had a genius navigator by the name of Frank Worsley, who used a compass and a technique called dead reckoning to steer them in the right direction. And he managed to take them all the way to South Georgia, which took, once again, about 16 days of very perilous and dangerous sailing. From the journals, we can read that so small was the boat and so great the seas that often our sails flapped idly in the calm between the crests of two waves. Then we would climb the next slope and catch the full fury of the storm with breaking water surging all around us. So he's describing, you know, a really very frightening moment in which you go up a wave and then you go down the wave and you find yourself in a moment of stillness between two walls of water, and then you go up the other wave in tremendous speed and acceleration, find yourself on the top of this wave, then all the way down again. This was quite a roller coaster. And after 16 days of this crazy trip, they finally land in South Georgia, which was really an unbelievable achievement. So on May 10, 1916, we fell to our knees drinking pure ice-cold water in long droughts that put new life into us. It was a splendid moment. And yet, they had yet another little problem. And the problem was that they landed in the wrong side of South Georgia. South Georgia is about 100 kilometers wide and about 50 kilometers tall on the map, from south to north. And the whaling station was on the other side of the island. So they had somehow, they had to cross the island from south to north. And no one ever did it before. This was the first time that we know of that human beings of any nation or, you know, any group of people that we know of crossed South Georgia by foot. And yet they set out to do it because they had no chance. They had to do it. Shackleton decided that 3 people will remain with the boats, and with the James Caird, and the other 3 will try to make it through the mountains to the other side of South Georgia and the whaling station. And that's what they did. And I gave you as some background material in the course website. There's a little movie that shows you how South Georgia looks like today. And here's a map that one of the team members, Tom Crean, made during the trip. Once again, they were blazing, you know, new ground and a new route that no one did before them. And by the way, it took, I think, something like 60 or 70 years before anyone else repeated this journey. Such was the difficulty of going through South Georgia. It was going through, you know, high slopes and steep mountains, ice, snow, without any equipment whatsoever. They just finished 16 days of sailing without reasonable supplies, without reasonable or sensible food, fuel, clothing, yet somehow they simply made it. And then when they reached the other side of the island, they came to the whaling station that they left about a year and a half earlier. And Shackleton knocked on the door, entered the whaling station, and nobody recognized him. No one recognized him because that's how he looked when he came back, and that's how he looked when he set out to the trip. So this was a complete surprise. Everyone counted him as dead. And so it was a moment of great joy and relief to see Shackleton coming back from the dead. Shackleton rested for 2 or 3 days in South Georgia, and then he managed to talk one of the whaling boats to go to Buenos Aires and arrange another ship as a rescue ship to go to Elephant Island. And so 4 months after leaving the men in Elephant Island, a rescue ship appeared. The men were picked up and on the boat, and all of them were rescued, and the trip back to London began. And so in September 1916, they board a ship and begin the long sail back to England. In this picture, we see Shackleton in the middle and Frank Wild on the left, and 2 more unidentified members of the team. And such was, the achievement of Shackleton, that he managed to rescue all the men in his party. They came back safely. No one got injured. No one got killed. So this was indeed quite an incredible rescue operation. Now, I want to remind you that there was another party in this story, the party that went to New Zealand, right? These were the folks who were supposed to go from New Zealand to the South Pole and leave food and supplies and fuel to Shekeltone. And so you may wonder what happened to them. Well, there's a few years ago, I found a book called The Lost Men, which describes the story of this party. They went to New Zealand as planned. From New Zealand, they sailed to McMurdo Bay, as planned. From McMurdo Bay, they striked a path all the way to the pole. They made it all the way to the pole. They did everything that was expected from them, sledging 1,300 kilometers and laying all the depots. And, these depots are still waiting for someone to use them because Shackleton didn't even manage to begin his part of the journey, being so busy rescuing his men and going back to South Georgia. So this was the very ironic end of the story and the ironic epilogue of this epic. Shackleton died in England, I think something like 15 years after he came back. That the life of explorers is such that you get to tremendous achievements very early in your career, and then it's downhill. Then life becomes boring, routine, alcohol kicks in, depression kicks in, and that's the unfortunate fate of many heroes of this course, including Shackleton. He asked to be buried in South Georgia, and this is Shackleton's grave. And here's a nice epitaph or a quote which was written about Shackleton. For scientific leadership, give me Scott. For swift and efficient travel, Amundsen. But when you are in a hopeless situation, when you are seeing no way out, get down on your knees and pray for Shekeltone. Incomparable in adversity, he was the miracle worker who would save your life against all odds and long after your number was up, which I think was a very accurate description of Shackleton's behavior during this adventure. I want to talk about a few leadership lessons that we can learn from Shackleton. And before doing so, I will take a break of 2 minutes just to arrange my controls, which are in complete balagan on my screen. So give me 2 minutes to arrange myself. I'll be right back with you. Okay, so some general lessons that we can learn from this story. Well, first of all, Shackleton was a master planner. Under distress, he always had plans. He always had the next step that we have to undertake. Every one of these steps looked like something which was manageable, something which was, just short of complete failure. 1,000 kilometers of drifting, and then another 500 kilometers in open water, and then building a camp on Elephant Island, and another 800 sail to South Georgia. So this was kind of a modular plan, and every time there was yet another challenge to undertake. Shackleton was great in building a team spirit. He knew how to get the best out of each person. He had great respect and great interest in every man on his team. He knew how to make everyone feel important. He knew how to delegate and give credit in a very generous way. And this is very important because I think one secret to leadership is to always find the one thing in which the person who work under you excel. Because every one of us has some competitive advantage. And it's the role of the leader to find what this competitive edge is and bring it out to the surface. So if I can take a metaphor from my own experience in mountain biking, some people are very good in going uphill. Some are very good in going downhill in a sort of a dangerous steep going down. Some people are very good in mechanics, in fixing the bike. Some people are good in navigation. And a great leader will find, the one, once again, skill that the person is good at, and it will encourage him to sort of bring this skill to the foreground and service the rest of the team. And in that respect, Shackleton was a really genius. He was also a very humane person. He was informal, unfussy, self-depreciating, very charming and full of humor. He knew how to control his feelings, and he never showed distress. He always radiated optimism and confidence. We know from reading his diary that at times he was in a very bad mood and a very grim situation because he knew that he was facing tremendous dangers, but he did not share this state of mind with his team. He always radiated confidence and optimism. And another thing which is special about Shackleton, I think, is that philosophically speaking, he found his calling in this great adventure. He was set out to cross Antarctica. This was the original plan. But at some point he realized that he was not going to make it. And then all of a sudden, it dawned on him that fate and destiny has put on his doorstep, so to speak, yet another incredible objective. And the incredible objective would be to bring his men safely back home. He understood that this new objective was no less glorious, no less important than reaching the pole or going to the other side of the continent. He took this challenge and decided that he's going to make it one way or another. And this is, a very sort of exciting point of time in which a person all of a sudden realizes that he's facing a moment that is going to redefine his life and to a certain extent redefine, history, or the history of exploration, at least. And, it's not a coincidence that in the Greek language, the words hero and hour are sort of connected to the same root, linguistically speaking. So we have hero, hour, Hera is the goddess of both time and wisdom and courage. We have Hercules. All these things, come to show you that heroism in the Greek tradition is something that happens in the context of time. There's a point of time in which a soldier has to make a decision whether he's going to bury his face on the ground when people are shooting at him, or step on his feet and charge forward. And this moment of time is going to define his life or death from this point onward. So once again, I said at the beginning of the lecture, opportunity favors the prepared. The hero is the person who manages to identify that the goddess of fate is knocking on the door, and maybe he should open the door and do something with it. And Shackleton, at some point of the ice, realized that he had a new meaning to his life, and the new meaning was to bring his men safely home. And he did it with spectacular success. Now, this reminds me of several life lessons, and I'm sure that everyone who hears this lecture can come up with his own or her own examples. But one of my favorite ones is a book written by Viktor Frankl, who was an Austrian psychiatrist before World War II. And during the war, Frankl finds himself in Auschwitz. And when he got out of Auschwitz, he managed to survive. He wrote a wonderful book called Man's Search for Meaning. This book became a tremendous bestseller. And in it, Frankl describes what it takes to survive in Auschwitz. And he said that when we are no longer able to change the situation, we are challenged to change ourselves, which is really, I think, a wonderful insight. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So this decision, how you're going to behave, what you're going to do, is a certain freedom which is never taken away from you. And Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how, can bear only, almost any hardship. And so, that's one lesson that we have from this story. We hold our destiny in our hands. We can decide how we're going to behave in every minute, and this is something that no one can take away from us. Another interesting lesson that I elucidate from this story is something that I took from Emily Dickinson, who was a great American poet, and she was a master of short poems, and one of them goes like this. tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Slant is alaoken, sort of twisted. Success in secret lies. Success sometimes is achieved by telling the truth in a very sort of circuitous way. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. So Emily Dickinson had this crazy habit of ending her poems with a hyphen, so I decided to leave it as is. And basically what she says in this lovely little poem is that truth as it is sometimes simply too difficult to bear and too difficult to cope with, especially if the truth is so pessimistic as Shekeltone was facing. So instead of sharing the true prospects with his team, instead of sharing his doubts, his uncertainties with the rest of the people, he always radiated an optimistic disposition. He always somehow twisted the truth, somehow made it look a little bit better, a little bit sweeter. And by doing this, by embellishing the truth, so to speak, he managed to create motivation and hope in his men. So that's another lesson. A leader need not always share the objective truth with the people under him or her. You may be manipulative in a positive way. So that's a story of Shackleton and the endurance. I hope that you enjoyed it. And I gave you some links in the website that you can pursue. And you can also find many additional resources on the internet, because this story is probably considered the greatest rescue operation in modern time, at least in Arctic explorations. So let me stop the presentation and try to answer some questions. Stop share.
I have a question.
Yes.
This is regarding the previous lecture. So what is interesting to me, suppose you're standing at the South Pole and you have to make your way back. Now, compass, every direction points north. So how did these guys, or how did Amundsen was able to navigate from the South Pole back to the ship that was waiting for him?
Yeah, well, they didn't use compass in the vicinity of the pole, but they did use compass and sextant on the way to the pole. I want to remind you that it takes about 1,400 kilometers to get to the pole. And what they did is, on the way to the pole, they marked very carefully the whole route to the pole. They used black flags on poles, and they built cairns, in Hebrew, rujums, from ice. And so when they got to the pole, they simply turned around and walked in exactly the same direction in which they arrived to the pole.
So what was the distance between any two markings? Because you need one blizzard and 10 miles and you're completely lost.
Well, I think the beginning, sort of in the vicinity of the pole, the marking was quite elaborate, but from this point onward, probably several tens of kilometers. I don't know exactly. Yes.
Question?
I have a question about when Shackleton arrived to point number 3 in one of the slides in the beginning, when he was locked in the ice.
Yes.
At that point, didn't it make sense to get off the ship, walk on the ice, and reach Antarctica by land?
Well, first of all, they were far away from Antarctica. They were, I think, about 200 kilometers from a place called Coates Land, which was their destination. And they couldn't possibly schlep all the equipment with them. And, we're talking about dozens of tons of equipment. And I think this was, one reason why I decided to try to go north instead of south. But obviously,
but then, they have to do a 1,000-mile trip to the south on land. So what's the difference between doing it on ice and doing it on land?
Yeah, ice is very rough, unlike land ice, which is smooth.
Yeah, that's
up and down, up and down.
Yeah, that's another reason. That's another detail that we have to consider. They were not on land; they were on a frozen sea, and a frozen sea is almost impossible to make decent progress on, because you just imagine that the waves freeze at some point, and therefore the whole terrain is full of ridges and crevasses, and it's almost impossible to sledge normally in such a terrain.
And the other question I had, when they reached South Georgia on the wrong side, why didn't they sail around?
They tried. They tried several times to sail around, but the currents were so enormous and so punishing that they were simply afraid to go through them. The waves were huge, and it was impossible to circumnavigate the island. They had to cross it. Also, they didn't know exactly what they were getting into. They thought they were just going, up the ridge and down to the other side of the island. But actually, it was something like a 50 kilometers trip going through several ridges. It took them 3 days to cross the island. And as I said, that's an astonishing detail to remember. It took another 70 years or so before another person managed to make the same crossing with modern equipment.
I have a question. Okay, go ahead.
Sort of a general question. In terms of, I'm not sure how the media reacted in those times. How aware was the public back in England in real time about the exploration? How well were they informed of what's happening in real time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the answer is that, first of all, the public was completely unaware of what was happening with Shekeltone, because normally in typical explorations, you go through several stages where you meet other ships or other explorers, and you can give them letters and maybe stories to the media. But in this particular case, since they left South Georgia, they didn't meet anything or anyone except for penguins and whales. And there was no way to send word back to England. So after about a year, the British public considered them as lost. And no one knew what happened to Shackleton and the men. And also you have to remember that about a year after they sailed from England, World War I erupted. And once the war was in full swing, very few people spent time thinking about Shackleton. It was not considered news anymore. Yeah. Of course, when it did come back, it was a tremendous event that provided a great wave of hope and optimism.
I have two questions if I can. So the first one is, not many described, at least in the slides, disorder like in the team. Like in situation like this, usually people they lose their minds and they go crazy, and it's hard to keep order and leadership or hierarchy in that sense. Is there any testimony of the way Shackleton held his team as a team together?
I'm not sure that I followed the question completely, but there were no signs at all of any person going insane in this story. The one point in which the people were pushed to the ultimate limits were actually the people who were left on Elephant Island. These people spent 4 months in complete uncertainty, and so some people got into depression and incapacitation, and becoming passive and placid. But no one no one became insane. No one started to run on the ice and doing crazy things. This never happened.
I meant more in the sense of not consider Shackleton as their leader, like disorder in the team. There was no moments like that.
Never happened. Never happened in Shackleton's team. Never. See, they were all grown-up people. They all chose to do this adventure. No one pushed them. No one pressed them. No one paid them money for doing it. They did it because they thought that this would be the greatest thing that they will ever do in their life. And they behaved in that way. And once again, all of them were, very competent and capable people. Carefully selected.
Yaron is trying to ask something, but he's muted.
Okay, so please unmute, Yaron. You're still mute, Yaron. You have to unmute your microphone. Good, now.
Yeah, I unmuted him.
Again, you're mute now. Good.
Now?
Now it's good. Now it's good. Yes.
Okay. What was, after all, the scientific value of this adventure?
Well, it was minor. The scientific virtue of these expeditions was mainly a pretext to raise money, to receive government support, and there was, I should correct myself. There were some very nice discoveries when it comes to life science. New species of penguins and seals were discovered. And maps were charted, which was very important, to chart the world, to see, what is the contour of Antarctica. No one knew, for example, that the South Pole was about 4,000 meters high. It was a huge discovery. People thought that the South Pole was just plain ice, sea level, but in fact it was going up, and they discovered the cross-Atlantic mountain range. So there were geographical discoveries, life science discoveries, but that's it. And this is in great contrast, for example, to expeditions that were made by Captain Cook, because Captain Cook made not only great discoveries, but he also made staggering astronomical observations, and he took with him astronomers who mapped, the heavenly stars and planets, and in that respect, it was a great contribution to astronomy and also to navigation. So the polar explorations were mostly acts of sheer bravado, courage, patriotic pride, and little scientific virtue. And, today the situation is completely different. Today we are very interested in what is going on the pole. In very respects, the pole holds the promise or the demise of our life on this planet. And you can say that, we can do what we do now thanks to Shekeltone and Scott and Amundsen, who blazed the way 100 years ago.
Thank you.
You said in your last lecture that Amundsen sent back 3 people for disciplinary reasons, and you never elaborate. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, actually, this connects very well with the other question that I had just a few minutes ago. about whether or not anyone doubted Shackleton's leadership. Well, it did happen in Amundsen's trip. After leaving what he called Fremheim, I forgot the name. Yeah, after leaving his winter camp, he was going with, I'm trying to remember, with 5 more people, 6 people altogether. And one of these people was a fellow named Johannessen. Johannessen was the same person who went with Nansen across Greenland. And he was a very powerful and capable person on the ice. And at the same time, he was bipolar. He was suffering from mania depressia. And at some point, he began to criticize Amundsen for various decisions that Amundsen made. And they got into disputes and quarrels. And when Amundsen felt that Johannessen was becoming a danger to the expedition, he stopped the progress. He nominated another person to take Johannessen and go all the way back to the winter camp, which was about 500 kilometers distance. And that's what happened. He started with 7 people. 2 went back, Johannessen and another person, and Amundsen continued with 4 more people going to the pole. So he did have a disciplinary problem, and he dealt with it very successfully. We have time for 2 more questions.
Why did they use steamboats? Why did they sail with the Columbus at the time? And didn't they use the steamboats which were invented at the I believe 20 years before their trip?
They had to use steamboats because, well, first of all, these were sailboats that also had steam engines. Now, they never used the steam engine unless they had to. And they had to use the steam engine when they got into the ice pack. In many cases, there's a lead of water, sort of a finger of water that you have to put your ship through it. And you cannot do it with sails. So you need diesel or fuel to go through the exact line of progress. And then once you're in open water, they would turn off the engine and raise the sails back.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so that's the end of our Shackletones and endurance story. And we'll meet next week on Wednesday. So next week, we're going to resume our regular schedule on Wednesdays at 15:45. So have a great week and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shimon.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
Bye, Shimon.
Bye.